I am pleased to introduce today Leslie Bechtel Van Orman. She is a teacher of students with visual impairments and an orientation and mobility specialist. She is the program manager for the Wyoming Department of Education for the Vision Outreach Services, and also the manager of the Deaf Blind Grant. And she has been on staff with WDE for many years, and we really appreciate her expertise. So please welcome Leslie Van Orman.
Thanks, Susan. I will share my screen with you all. All right, and let me grab my notes. All right, thank you all for being here. This presentation really is based around some work that we've been doing for the last couple of years as part of our deaf-blind project. And the goal of this work has really been to increase the quantity and the quality of literacy instruction for students who are deaf-blind. That sort of flows right over and supports also many of our students who have significant intellectual disabilities. So I'm going to share some information about what we've been doing, but I really just want to focus and give you sort of a 5,000-foot view of what literacy instruction should include for our students with the most significant intellectual disabilities. So there are three components that we've been addressing through our literacy initiative. The first one is tied to communication, which is really a core piece of literacy, and really for our students with significant intellectual disabilities, it's really the starting point for them. And the communication work that we've been doing really focuses on our pre-symbolic and early symbolic learners. So these are kids that don't have any formal or flexible way to communicate with symbols or signs or speech. And then the second component and sort of training focus we've had is looking at emergent literacy. And that's a program that is based on research from the University of North Carolina, and really talking about how we give exposure to emergent literacy activities for our kids who are not yet ready to learn conventional literacy. And then the final one is it has been really our focus for this school year, which has been conventional literacy for students with significant intellectual disabilities. And these are kids who have intellectual disability, but they know most of the letters in the alphabet. They have formalized, they're able to communicate effectively. They have an effective communication system. They engage actively in shared reading, and they understand that letters and words are part of writing, that writing is tied to letters and words. So today I'm really going to focus on those two first topic areas, sort of the communication and the emergent literacy piece. So when we're talking about this group of students who have significant intellectual disabilities, we have some historical assumptions that some unfortunately still exist, but those include things like these kids are not academic, they need to focus on life skills, or this is a group of kids who can't learn to read. And even some of these kids, the belief that some of these kids have such complex communication issues that they won't ever be able to communicate in a conventional way. So, but what we do know now is different. And I think that the big pivot point for that was really the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004. And it changed the expectations. It legally changed the expectations for academic learning for all students, because it forced us to think about how to extend our standards and how we were going to provide academic learning for every student that we work with. There wasn't a lot of research, at that point about how you would do it. We just knew that we had to do it. But we have a lot more research now that really drives what we, like some of the decisions we're making about literacy for these students. So when we think about what we know about learning of students with significant intellectual disabilities, we know that a cognitive disability is going to affect a student's intellectual ability and their metacognition, their ability for long and short-term memory might be impaired also. We know that these students learn more slowly than other students. We know that generalizing can be really difficult, and we know that they need a ton of repetition in order to learn and sustain learning and remember the learning that they've received. When we talk about communication, we now know that of this group of students, that 35% of them are going to have complex communication needs. And these students we do know that these students can acquire symbolic communication skills now. We know from research studies that most of these students receive any instruction that they have in using augmentative communication. That could be low tech or high tech. We know that they receive that from a speech language pathologist. And the next bullet is a little interesting and worrisome based on the prior one, which is most of these kids receive less than an hour of instruction from a speech language pathologist in a week. And that actually comes from the American Speech and Hearing Association, which is the professional organization for speech language pathologists and audiologists. So they're not getting much instruction, and the instruction that they do get is from or around using augmentative communication usually comes solely from a speech language pathologist. So we know that that amount of instruction and communication that they're receiving definitely doesn't meet the intensity level that they need, or the level of repetition that they're going to need in order for those students with intellectual disabilities to acquire flexible and symbolic language. So this always makes me think about babies and toddlers and how they acquire language and how they acquire literacy skills. And we know that for a typically developing kid, that they're going to have thousands and thousands of repetitions of language receptively in order to get to a point where they can effectively use communication expressively. So, so the research that we have now around communication really shows us that our kids are not getting the level and intensity of exposure they need to communication in order to become communicators for many of them. We have research on reading also. We know that students with intellectual disabilities are frequently not considered to have the potential to be literate. When students in this group do receive literacy instruction, very much of it is just sight word based. But because of the research that's been happening, we also know that if we integrate traditional reading approaches, alphabetic awareness, phonemic awareness, phonics, all of these pieces, if those are integrated into the communication or into the educational program for students with significant disabilities, some of these students can learn to read, and not just learn to read. Some of these students when given the right supports and instruction, can learn to decode. So reading skills can increase for students with intellectual disabilities, and it's not age dependent. You know, we know that there's this, when kids are younger, they have greater neurological plasticity, but we also have seen middle school and high school students and even adults who have learned to read, you know, because they've received direct and intensive instruction. So we have a lot of historical assumptions, but as we started down the path for this project, the only assumption that we decided we were willing to operate with was the assumption that all kids can develop literacy skills. And when we're talking about literacy skills, we're talking about these 4 components of literacy, and that's listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And for our students with significant intellectual disabilities, one of the assumptions we can't make that we've made in the past is that these have to happen in some order. I think we used to think, you know, we really can't teach them to read until they can communicate. But now we know these 4 things are all linked, and that they're all equally important, and that learning sort of spirals through all 4 of those areas as kids learn to communicate and to read and to write. Our students have a lot of barriers that make this more difficult. You know, many of our students are medically fragile, and especially at birth, often our students and their families spend a ton of time focused on just making sure that that child survives. That takes away a lot of time that parents would spend reading to kids, that kids would spend watching parents read and write and getting some of those emergent literacy concepts into their heads. So they have this lack of exposure to emergent literacy activities right off the bat. Many of our students have physical limitations that can be mobility related, motor related limitations. It could be hearing loss or vision loss. But they actually those limitations actually are accessibility issues. They can't see what's happening or can't move to flip through the pages of a book. So that is another barrier. You know, then we go back to some of those things we talked about in terms of what we know about learning. You know, they need more repetition. They're going to learn more slowly. They may need have difficulty generalizing those skills. So there are a lot of barriers that our students also have, in addition to just the barriers in terms of intellectual disability. So how do we create a foundation for literacy for these students? And this list is from the book that's going to be given away to those people who complete the survey today. And it's a book by Karen Erickson and David Copenhaver called Comprehensive Literacy for All. So these are sort of some of the core things that need to be in place for our kids to ensure that they have the ability to learn to read and write. So the first thing, knowledgeable others, is really the fact that our students need to have an educational team that really believes they can become literate, and who don't see a lack of progress as a lack of student ability, but they see it as a failure in our instructional system or in the way that we're teaching kids. So taking the responsibility ourselves for the system that we're using not working for the kid, instead of the kid not having the ability. They need to have a means of communication and interaction. The International Communication Project says, that communication is the most fundamental of human capacities. We know students can learn symbolic communication, and we also know that they can learn it simultaneously as they're getting emergent literacy skills. They need to have repetition with variety. We need to maintain student interest. We need to prevent teaching them in ways that just require rote responses. We need to allow new learning in activities that are anchored in familiarity. We want cognitive engagement in our students. We want to encourage them to think and reason and use judgment. We want them to be self-directed learners. And we want cognitive clarity. Too many of our students are asked to do learning tasks that really don't connect to the world they know or understand and aren't connected to things that are meaningful to them. And personal connection to the curriculum. We want to provide students with a sense of belonging and help them make personal connections to learning. We also want to encourage risk-taking. We want to avoid correcting students and really instead use mistakes as a way to drive what instruction we provide and how we model reading and writing. We also want comprehensive instruction. So we want an equal focus on reading comprehension, self-directed reading, word study, and writing. And we want a significant time allocation for this. If our typical learners are getting 90 minutes or 2 hours of instruction a day, then how in the world can we provide less to students who we know need more repetition and need more intense instruction? And then we've got to have high expectations. The Literacy Bill of Rights has a great, one of the rights it lists for people is the right to live and learn in environments that maintain the expectations and attitudes that all individuals are literacy learners. So those are sort of the foundational philosophical things and logistical things that really need to be in place for our students to succeed. And so as we're talking about communication, as I said earlier, it's a critical part of literacy. So 35% of our students with significant intellectual disabilities, if you remember, also have complex communication needs. And our students have limited access to meaningful demonstrations of receptive language. But if we can provide them with more support in communication, then these students can acquire symbolic communication skills. And a lot of the work we've been doing is tied to research through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, their Center for Literacy and Disabilities. And they're in a research project called Project Core, which really focuses on teaching students with significant intellectual disabilities to use core vocabulary to communicate. So we're going to talk a little bit about that.
So Leslie, this is Susan, and I just, the slide that you had previous, just to me was so impactful because what you have said before is, you know, these students have lack of exposure, right? And so, and when you're talking about the repetitions that they need and the time and allocation, I mean, that is so important. And I just wanted to emphasize that because we do know they have physical limitations and the need for repetition. And then you're right, when it comes time, when we're talking about significant time allocation, they should be getting way more than what, you know, what a typical intervention would have for, you know, it's often that, you know, students with a learning disability or what have you may have 90 minutes of intervention time. So I really appreciated what you said about the time and the repetition and the exposure. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's true. And I think, we've had teams across the state implementing some of these, some of the strategies from from our project. And we're seeing kids who still aren't getting the time allocation that would be ideal, but we're seeing improvement in those kids, which makes you think, like, if these kids were really getting 90 minutes of instruction or 2 hours of instruction, where would we be then? So
And throw in assistive technology in there.
yes, exactly right, exactly right. So when the University of North Carolina rolled out this Project Core research project, which we're going to talk about for a while here, they did, one of the places they did it was in this Hillside Developmental Center, which is a self-contained school for students with disabilities, students with intellectual disabilities. And they sent their staff in and they trained the staff at the Hillside Developmental Center to do just a few key things around communication. They were using a core vocabulary, either in augmentative high-tech communication systems, or just a 36 grid core vocabulary board, just laminated piece of paper with 36 little symbols on it. They taught the staff there to use aided language input to provide wait time for students, to look for the kind of behaviors that students would have that they could attribute communicative meaning to. And then they taught them to model and to repeat and to expand on what students were learning, or what the communication students were making. So if a student didn't point at the symbol on the sheet, but instead vocalized about something, the staff would model pointing to an appropriate word on their communication board. If the student pointed to a particular word on the communication board, the staff would respond to the student, touch the same symbol they were using, and then add a second symbol. So simple things like that. And they had the staff do this throughout the students' days, all day long. When they started, they assessed the students using a tool called the communication matrix. And they saw improvement on the communication matrix with 100% of students in that facility. The cool thing is that although they didn't target any academics, they didn't go into the literacy piece, they didn't tie anything to state standards, they saw a huge jump in alternate assessment scores for the students in this school. When they started the program, there were no students in this entire development in the Hillside Developmental Center that were proficient on the alternate assessment. And they actually had 93% of their students who were scored at the very lowest possible level on the alternate assessment. By the second year of implementing this Project Core communication piece, they had 13% of their students proficient on the alternate assessment, and 4 years later, they had 37%. Now, 50% of the kids were still scoring at the lowest level, but again, there was not a single child who didn't show improvement in communication skills from this work. So super encouraging. And so when we're talking about communication, it should really permeate all aspects of a student's life. And there aren't going to be we're not going to ask students to have any prerequisite skills, nothing, in order to participate. And so speech language pathologists drive this work, but the real work comes from teachers and teaching assistants who are going to maximize the use of communication all day long across all environments, so that the speech language pathologist can really be providing some more specialized support to address student needs and support the implementation in the classroom. So the first step is, of course, a comprehensive evaluation. We want vision information. We want to know what kids can see. We want to know what our students can hear. We want to know what their most effective learning channels are and what learning media would be the best for them to use. We need to know what their gross and fine motor skills are, so that we know if there's is there a particular piece of positioning equipment or a particular tool that they need in order to be able to access and move a hand to touch augmentative communication system. What are their communication abilities and what kinds of access technologies do they need? Because we're going to have to know things like, can they physically touch a symbol? If so, what size of symbol does it need to be for them to be successful? Are they going to need to use eye gaze? What accommodations are we going to need to make for our students, for each student? And then we want to, and then we're going to start to introduce core vocabulary to these students. So the University of North Carolina uses what they call a universal core vocabulary, other apps and augmentative communication systems, all of them have core vocabulary capability, or most of them do, on them. And most of those core vocabularies share a lot of words. But the project core words that were selected, they wanted to find a small number of words that were frequently used. And they wanted those words to be able to apply across the standards in all of our educational standards. They wanted words which could be used across environments. And so the goal that they really had, they wanted to find words that could be used with such a high level of frequency that the students would be exposed to those words a ton, but also that they would, that as soon as students started to understand them, that they would be able to more flexibly communicate. So they went through an extensive process of selecting these words. And so here are the 36 universal core vocabulary words. And this is, it's words that you use every day. It's the words that we use to communicate with each other all the time. Things like all, can, different, look, some, who, why, you, I, things like that. So this is you can see this list of words would allow you to talk about across any environment. You could have communication and talk about different topics. This is really meant to serve as sort of a foundational vocabulary, the starting point, where students a vocabulary students can use throughout the whole day and not just during one activity or one setting.
Leslie, we have a comment in the chat that says this person used the core vocabulary in Texas and all students had great improvement. So yeah, just kind of re-emphasizing what you just said.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And it is, this is the symbol array that they use. This is the Mayor Johnson picture communication symbol version of it. So there are 36 symbols, and they're represented by, or 36 symbols and words. They use symbols in addition to the words to support student learning. And you can use, you can use the symbols from whatever, symbols from whatever communication device that you have, whether that's LAMP or Dynavox or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just that you're using symbols and these core words to support students. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. These are sometimes this is what these symbol arrays are sort of what we think of when we think of symbol systems for students with significant intellectual disabilities. And the core vocabulary is very different from these. And these are, you know, animal symbols, and one is of line drawings, one's of photos. But these are really more concrete vocabulary. They're linked to a specific topic. Our students can demonstrate some success in matching these symbols with the animals or the objects they represent. You know, it's mostly nouns that are, you know, it's all nouns. However, these types of symbols, they really lack value when communicating. And they're about, and they're very narrow. We can only talk about animals if we are using this symbol set. And we rarely, they don't lend themselves to the repetition level that, that we need to use daily. On the other hand, if you think about a word like the word turn, which is one of our core vocabulary words, you know, just take a second and think about all the different ways that you can use the word turn. So we could be talking about taking turns. We could be talking about turning a knob. We could even be talking about like a scientific concept of how ice turns into water. So, so there are a lot of ways to use a core vocabulary word, and it's not such a narrow definition as some of the more typical symbols that we see used in our classrooms. The other cool thing is that these words can be combined easily, and they just totally expand what communication can be for students. So for example, the word open can be used as a single message. If a student, if you were eating lunch and the student had a juice box in front of them and they touched the word open, they would have communicated to you clearly what they wanted to happen. But we can also combine it with another word like I open, or open it, or help open it. And this makes it super easy to expand, for students to expand on their messages, and it allows us to expand on to use core vocabulary to demonstrate how to put words together in meaningful ways. So sometimes when we use core vocabulary, when core vocabulary is introduced, some of us have the initial instinct to say, I know I did, you know, these words are way too abstract for our kids, you know, or my student is much more of a concrete, you know, thinker. They need a concrete object symbols or, you know, picture symbols, or cognitively, they just can't understand this. And first, I want to say that this doesn't replace the, you know, a picture symbol that you're using to make a choice between, you know, 2 favorite movies or 2 preferred activities. And it doesn't take the place of, you know, an anticipatory daily schedule of that's made up of objects or pictures. However, the research shows us that students are able to learn abstract symbols, and this occurs because of, and this is likely occurring because of the frequency with which kids are exposed to these words. And these words are flexible and powerful. And so they're also can be very motivating for our students. So if you think about how many times a day can you use a symbol and model the use of a symbol for eating or for going to the bathroom, you know? But how many times a day could you model the use during a school day of the word go? Like, we're going all day long in school, and we can model that hundreds of times within the course of a week. Same with the word help or open or it. Any of those words, we have just so many opportunities to model their use. So then the frequency of those words allows our students to overcome the abstractness of the concepts that they stand for. So how do we teach students to use core vocabulary? So a few things. We're going to provide access to their augmentative communication system, whether it's high or low tech, at all times. And we're going to do that not only so the student could use it anytime they wanted to, but also so that we can use their device to demonstrate how we communicate. We're also going to closely observe student behaviors, and we're going to attribute meaning to those behaviors and those actions that students take. And then we're going to encourage them to communicate, but we're not going to require them to. We're not going to grab their hand and have them and do hand over hand to have them touch a symbol. We are just going to be encouraging them to communicate. So some of the ways we might see students communicate might be body movements, clicking noises, kicking, turning away from unpreferred things, closing their eyes, reaching for something, pushing something off of a wheelchair tray. All of these forms of communication can happen and do happen really without the student intending to communicate to someone else. So the student's really not always intentionally trying to get a particular response from us, but if we observe them and attribute meaning and clearly tell them what we think they're communicating, we can teach them to use those behaviors to communicate with us intentionally. And the great thing about that, is that once the student starts to make that connection and understand that they can influence how another person responds based on their behaviors, then it gets easier and easier to help them develop intentional symbolic communication. So, so an example would be, if we're gonna attribute meaning, we want to first observe the student, determine what we think they're trying to communicate. Then we're gonna very clearly tell them what they did communicate to us and help build their understanding about how their behavior is something that they can use to influence how we respond to them. So in terms of symbolic communication, as I said, intentional communication becomes much easier for a student. It's easier intentional communication is easier for us to understand, and it makes it easier to show the students how they can use symbols to communicate with others. So as our students are beginning to use speech and signs or symbols to communicate, we're not going to discourage these other ways of communication, the pushing things away, turning away, vocalizing, any of those things. We're going to continue to honor all kinds of communication from students. But we are going to encourage and support more precise symbolic communication. Sometimes we think about when we start to use augmentative communication, we're so intent on students using it, we forget that we don't want to devalue other modes of communication. So our students are going to access core vocabulary in a wide variety of ways. Some of those may be on an augmentative communication device, maybe a hard copy core vocabulary sheet like I showed in an earlier slide. And actually the Project Core website, which is project-core.com, they actually have a ton of these different arrays of symbols that you can actually print out. And these are some of them. Several formats are available based on the visual function of the child, their fine motor skills, whether they are using touch or eye gaze. And And some students may need partner-assisted scanning to choose which symbol they want by indicating when we point to the one that they want to use. So these are, there are a lot of assistive technology systems that have the universal core vocabulary built into them. That includes assistive wear, Dynavox, cough drop lamp, smart box. So a lot of those already exist. On the slide that you see in front of you, on the top left is 9 pages that each have 4 symbols on them. Those are designed for students that have either that have difficulty seeing more than 4, the busyness of all 36, or they need them larger. Then the top middle is just the standard 36 symbol array. The top right shows a tactile symbol. Below it is a 9 symbol array has black background for high contrast. Also, sometimes students with cortical visual impairment will be able to see that more easily. The one in the center bottom is an eye gaze selection tool. And the one on the bottom left with the vertical arrangement or the horizontal arrangement is for partner assisted scanning. So we would be pointing to the word like and saying, like, do you want like? And then the student is giving us some symbol of communication. That might be an eye blink, that might be a switch touch, with a head switch, or a Big Mac switch, gross motor touch to a Big Mac switch or something like that. Then we would go on to want, do you want, until we got the symbol, or until they gave us the signal that we had reached the symbol that they wanted to utilize. So the communication matrix I had mentioned a little bit earlier, this is a fantastic communication assessment, and it helps us really recognize and build on the communication behaviors of our beginning communicators. It was developed by a speech language pathologist named Charity Rowland, and it's actually a free assessment. It's available online at communicationmatrix.org. And it's designed to identify the behaviors that a student is currently using to communicate and to provide a framework for thinking about communication goals and interventions. And it really helps you recognize those sort of small but important steps that our students make as they're beginning to learn to express themselves. So as we're giving kids access to the core vocabulary, we're going to use aided language input to teach students to use the symbols for communication. And that means that we're going to model using the core vocabulary either on a core board or on the student's augmentative communication device. And we're going to encourage the student to communicate, but we're not going to use hand-over-hand manipulation in order to facilitate it. They need those repetitions of receptive language across environments to begin to learn the flexibility of the symbols for communication and how to make them work. And just like, if I always go back and think about young, typically developing babies and toddlers, if the baby says, mama, we don't say, no, you need to say mom, or, we let them say, we let them explore communication, and we support them through enthusiasm and through modeling and doing that. So if we're going to get thousands of repetitions using these symbols, we really do need to be doing this aided language input throughout the day with our students. So when we use aided language input, we're modeling sort of just one step above where the student is. So in this picture, you see a kid who's pointing instead of using the core vocabulary sheet that's on the lanyard around his neck. And And what we would do is we would label that behavior and their communicational intent, and then model the use of the core vocabulary. So I would say, I see you pointing, you want another book. And as I was saying the word want, which is a core vocabulary word, I would touch the word want and make sure I got visual input, visual response, and that the kid was watching me do it. So, and if the student had pointed to the word want and then looked at the book, we would point at the symbol for want, and then we would add a little more. So I would say, you want it. And so I would touch the words want and the word it. So if he's using one symbol, I'm going to model 2 symbol use. And if he's just using, if he's just pointing, then I'm going to use a single symbol use as a model. So one of the things in a book I recently read that I pulled into this presentation, the book was Principles of Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology. And they were really talking about how important student initiation is in learning. So the most effective learning takes place when students initiate a behavior. And when you watch that happen on a brain scan, there's a surge of electrical activity in the brain. And then you think about how we teach kids, often think about how often we teach kids with significant intellectual disabilities in some sort of rote response and copying, tracing letters, hand over hand, and all of those things are super well-meaning, but the reality is we're eliminating this surge of electrical activity that personal initiation of the child will take. So one of the great things in both the communication piece and the emergent literacy piece is just the desire to have kids initiate the behaviors for their learning and communication and literacy. So we're going to start with universal core vocabulary with picture symbols because it's really the fastest way that we can support students in getting meaningful communication. But the ultimate goal is the different set of symbols, because that's the set of symbols we want them to learn is complex and challenging, but it only has 26 symbols, and it allows the flexibility for a person to communicate everything. So we're going to be, at the same time that we're teaching symbol communication, we're also moving students to become to learn the alphabet and become readers. So the emergent literacy piece of this dovetails nicely into the communication. And emergent literacy is really just all of the understandings and skills related to reading, writing, and listening and speaking that eventually develop into conventional literacy. So how do we know when a kid is an emergent learner and not a conventional learner of literacy? So we are going to ask these questions. Does the student know most of the letters of the alphabet most of the time? Do they engage actively during shared reading? Do they have a means of communication and interaction? Do they understand that writing involves letters and words? And if the answer to all those questions is yes, then that's a kid who is a more conventional, is ready for more conventional literacy. But if any of those are no, then we're going to provide them with emergent literacy instruction. So how do literacy skills progress? First of all, students have to engage meaningfully in the world, and then they have to explore related print and braille to that experience in order to gain an understanding of how it works and why it's useful. And then the students also have to be interacting with others who are literate so they can see models who are modeling reading and writing, speaking, and listening. Because the development of emergent literacy is dependent on access to print, the frequency of exposure, that meaningful engagement with print. It is very common, as we talked about earlier, for students with significant disabilities, people with significant disabilities of all ages, to still be emergent in their understanding of literacy because they have had such a limited exposure to learning opportunities. So we need to provide students with quantity and quality and frequency and variety. So how are we going to do that? We're going to focus on skill development. We're going to focus on integrated activities that integrate communication and literacy. We're going to use print in meaningful contexts, and we're going to give kids independent exploration of reading and writing tools and materials. So if we are able to do this, our students will begin to develop alphabetic knowledge, phonological awareness, language comprehension and communication skills, and we'll be moving them towards more conventional literacy. So what the project we've been doing involves 5 structured literacy activities, and that's shared reading, shared writing, instruction in alphabetic knowledge and phonemic awareness, independent reading, and independent writing. We're sort of beginning to use the word self-directed reading and self-directed writing, because we sort of get some pushback about our students are never going to be independent. But I sort of like to keep them in there because I think it's a more powerful word. Anyway, so just to give you a little overview of what these different activities look like. So shared reading is a group or individual activity in the classroom. We want to be sure that all of our students who have those complex communication needs have access to their core vocabulary. And then the teacher or school staff is going to be reading a page or a sentence out of a book, and then providing some wait time for student responses. And the whole time the teacher is observing the student or the students really carefully to see if they have any behavior or actions that can be interpreted as communication. So the student may flop their hand down and touch a word on their core vocabulary, and we're going to take that as communication. They may stare intently at something on the page, and we're going to take that as communication. And we're going to respond to them and model, in that response, we're going to model use of their communication system. So we're not going to ask comprehension questions like, what is this animal? Or where is this boy going? We're going to ask open-ended questions like, or make statements or ask open-ended questions. So we might ask a question like, I wonder what that boy is going to do next. Or wow, I can't believe how fast that rabbit ran. And then we're going to wait for some student interaction. We're going to wait for them to respond in the conversation. And these interactions over time with sufficient wait time for student thinking are going to create language learning opportunities for our students. And then, dovetailing back into the core vocabulary, if a student is, if a student does respond, either through use of a symbol or through some other communicative intent of closing their eyes or making a noise, then we're going to attribute meaning to that and then respond with modeling on their communication system.
Leslie, this just made me think about kids' reactions sometimes to logos, signs and things for businesses like the Golden Arches or the
Yep.
Lego system, the Lego brand, or, and really tuning into some of those things when they have a reaction to that.
Yep.
So I was thinking about that.
Yeah, it makes you realize how, you know, that same reaction to a symbol can be channeled into the beginning of communication and literacy. So
Yes,
yeah.
very much so.
And this, you know, really the basis of the whole shared reading activity is all about interaction. It's this magic that happens between an adult and a student when we're reading a book together. So some of those key components are that everyone has to have access to a communication system. We want to maximize interaction during shared reading. We want to, you know, some of our students at the emergent literacy level are speakers. They're going to talk, but for others will have high tech devices. So it can be sort of a challenge to balance those things, but one of the big pieces is just to be supporting students and making connections between their experiences and the book. And we're going to make comments and not ask students questions. And that's the hardest thing, man. I like to write down the comments that I want to make or a backup comment, because I go right to asking comprehension questions. So, and as much as possible, we want students to direct the conversation. At the beginning, this is going to be completely foreign to students, but hopefully over time, they'll begin to be more and more of an active participant. And then we want to read and pause and wait for our students to respond. And when we're pausing, we have to remember we're observing them closely. You know, they may move their arm or make a noise or smile or point to a symbol, and we need to take that as communication. I see you smiling. I think you like the cat in this story. And then we're also going back and supporting that aided language by touching the word like when we say, I think you like that cat in the story. We want to use short books that have appropriate language complexity, and we want those books to be interesting to the student. That can be a little difficult with our older students, to find books that are short and have appropriate language complexity, but are also interesting. There's actually another great resource through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill called the Tar Heel Reader. And this is a repository of teacher-made electronic books that include tons of books that are age appropriate and language and don't have high language complexity. So you can find a very simple version of Tom Sawyer. They have a lot of books for our older students that align with our state standards. So a super great resource. It's on a PowerPoint platform. So, and it can be switch activated. So a student can hit a switch and turn the pages on the books on the computer, or you can print the books off and staple them together for students to use too. Shared writing. This is really the most predictable chart writing is really the most effective method of shared writing that we're using. That's where we use a sentence stem as a framework, and that's for providing repetition. And really, it also decreases the expressive language demands on our students. And so we actually use 5 different activities throughout the course of the week around one single predictable chart writing activity. So this allows teachers to sort of target the conventions of writing and focus on particular words or letters throughout the week. The sentence stem we use core vocabulary in it because it gives us the opportunity to repeat it multiple times. And then students complete their sentence and they can make those choices by selecting a picture or an object. In this example, which is a sentence stem, the sentence stem I put on with the theme of cold outside. The teacher brought in a big bin of hats and gloves and boots and coats and scarves. And then the kids were able to choose what they wanted to write about at the end of their sentence stem. We put the student's name at the end of the sentence so we know which one belongs to who. And then we can do one of these steps each day of the week. So the first day we write the chart with all of the students. And then the second day we reread the chart. Students can take turns with a pointer pointing at the words as the teacher reads them. And sort of working with the chart. This is the point where you get some really nice opportunities to talk about the spacing between words, the punctuation at the end, which students chose things that were the same, which students chose things that were different. This third activity is we rewrite those sentence stems. Each student with help rewrites the sentence stem, or each student is given a sentence strip with their sentence rewritten on it. And then the student practices rereading their sentence on their sentence strip. And then we ask students to cut it apart and then we mix it up and have them work to rebuild it, comparing it to what's on the chart. And once again, this is one of those things where we want the students to initiate the activity. If they can independently cut, we have them do it themselves. If they chop through the middle of a word, we compare it to the word on the chart, and then we can rewrite it and give them another shot at it. After a couple times of trying it, if they're not, if it's still difficult, then we'll give them some assistance in doing it. Then there's a game that we use to play, or we play, called Be the Sentence. We write the words of the sentence stem and all of the student ends, or the endings for all of the students on big, just 8.5 by 11 paper, but then have the kids physically move to reorder those words into the correct sentence. And that's a group activity, so that's pretty fun. And then the last thing is, some teachers make a book ahead of time and then the students all review it. Other teachers glue the words, have the students select a picture and they cut and paste it and glue their sentence into a book that is kept in the classroom. So each page has a separate, or each student has a separate page for their sentence. And I was in a classroom earlier this year, and those books, they had 30 of these books in their classroom, and they were worn out because the kids have a great deal of ownership of the book, and they also are familiar with the story because they lived it oftentimes, because in this classroom, it was about every field trip or special activity they had. So it's a very powerful process. And then the big things about predictable chart writing to be thinking of is that sentence stem is really the most important part. We want to use core vocabulary in that sentence stem. It allows us for repetition of those powerful and abstract words. And then the repeated writing of these sentences and manipulating of these sentences with the same words lined up all the way down the chart really helps develop some strong print concepts for our students. This also builds on early skills in word identification, spelling, capitalization, punctuation. And those, as I said, the resulting books are super motivating for kids. So alphabetic and phonemic awareness. So we used to think that students had to have some precursor skill before they could be taught the alphabet. But as we said earlier, research has taught us a lot. And we now know that whatever symbols we put in front of kids, they are going to learn them. And so we can teach the alphabet to all of our students. we want, when they're, it's a tough thing though, when kids are gaining alphabetic awareness, they have to figure out the shapes of uppercase and lowercase letters and how they are related to each other, which ones go together, and how to make or select each letter for writing when they're trying to write something. We want some good activities we can use is the use of alphabet books. And through the Tar Heel Reader, there are tons of age-appropriate, student interest-based alphabet books. There's an alphabet book about football, which a high school boy might really enjoy. So use of we want to teach that, use letters in the environment to expose them to the to just the myriad of letters around them. That could be on signs or menus, food packaging. We can play with different letter shapes. That can be magnetic letters, or drawing drawing letters in sand or whatever. Card games with alphabet letters, like knockoffs of Slapjack or Go Fish. Using the names or the letters in student names is super useful. Students are 10 times more likely to recognize the letters in their names just because of the passion they have for their name and the amount of exposure they have to those letters. There's also a great letter of the day structure. And if anybody wants that resource, reach out to me and I'll give it to you. I can get it to you. They talk about how we've always done the letter of the week, but that if you do the letter of the week, you don't have much opportunity to get that repetition in that is so critical for our students. So if we do a letter of the day, then by the first 26 days of school, we've been through the alphabet. And we can go through it in different orders, in the order of most frequent letters, in the order of the alphabet, in the order of letters based on which letters are the most difficult to pronounce. And so then on day 27, we can start back through the alphabet in some other order, doing a short mini lesson on the alphabet letter. And if kids in the class have mastered the letter O and the letter C and the letter Z, then we don't have to teach those again. Then we can focus on 22 letters or 23 letters for the next go round. Then phonological awareness is really the ability to identify sounds within words. We want to, kids start to hear the difference between words like he or she. And then they recognize syllables in words. Then comes initial sound recognition, like the similarity between good and go, and then rhyming. And first they recognize that words rhyme, and then they start to understand that that's frequently because they end in the same way. And these are great, like phonological awareness activities are great activities to use in those like sponge activities in those little minutes while you're lined up going to lunch or getting ready to go home, but lots of things, fun things like raps and rhymes and poems and tongue twisters can be useful in providing exposure for our students. For independent reading, we want our students are going to interact with books based on the exposure they've had to them and their understanding of books. So some of them may just flip pages, others may look at pictures, some might note letters and words that they recognize, but having independent reading time is a really critical opportunity to see how our students apply what we've been teaching. And how they interact when they're doing this independently can then drive our focus for future instruction. We want to have a wide variety of reading materials, fiction, nonfiction, catalogs, wordless texts, newspapers, comic books. We want to connect kids with books that they'll find interesting. We need to make sure that that the materials are accessible based on their needs. And we should have age respectful and ability appropriate materials for our students as they get older. Because our students,
Leslie, I was also thinking about the different ways in which reading materials can be presented now. I mean, electronically, paper. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that students can be exposed to literary material.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's a good point, Susan, because it makes me think that, this really should be reading time. So this is probably, we're not going to use the auditory options that we have, although for some students, we might use that karaoke style highlighting and auditory output, just because it does pull their attention to the words, but we're hoping, but yeah, we have a lot of access to text that we did, the easy access to text and accessible formats for our students now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And because our students have been doing shared reading, they've been doing predictable chart writing, they've been having lessons about the alphabet and activities that focus on phonemic awareness. Independent reading and independent writing both are activities that allow us to observe them applying the skills we've been teaching. And it may start out as the shortest ever independent reading time that you've ever had. It may just be a few minutes long to begin with. But as kids gain knowledge about how to interact with reading materials, we see more and more independent engagement in books. Independent writing is an opportunity for students to apply what they've learned about the alphabet and phonemes and phonology and print concepts. We're not going to do any copying and tracing of letters. Students are not going to be corrected for anything that they write. We're going to, again, provide improvement through instruction and modeling. For our students with complex communication needs, we also want to provide a shared topic so that we have context for communication. So learning to write provides the opportunity for our kids to have unlimited expression. And for our students who use augmentative communication devices, it opens up a world of communicative ability when they can use the alphabet as the access to what they want to say to the world. So key considerations are we want to support our students getting their thoughts on paper. So we need to provide a meaningful context for written expression. And even when students seem to be randomly scribbling or pounding letters on a keyboard, they are producing a text that we can acknowledge and that we can discuss. One of the big important things is to find the pencil that they need in order to write. Some students are going to be able to use a pencil. Other students with significant intellectual disabilities can use a keyboard, and some are going to need some sort of alternate pencil that requires eye gaze or a partner assisted selection in order to write. And you can see in this picture on the slide on the bottom right is a student with a switch on each side of his head. The teaching assistant to his left is flipping a little card or an alphabet array, and he is telling her, either hitting his head one side to say it's not there, or I want something, or it is there. And then if the letter he wants to say is on that page, then she'll point to each letter and he'll tell her nope, nope, yes, by using the switch either to the left or right of his head. We want we have to give students a way to write. We have to give them an interesting topic to write about. And we have to give them time to write. And then we have to provide meaningful responses to their writing. So this is an example of a sample from a student who was doing an independent writing activity. And for this one, the teacher had the class select and cut out a picture in a magazine to write about, and this student selected a picture of a coffee pot. And the student just created what looks like some random marks or approximations of letters. And once again, there was no hand over hand. When we're responding to the student writing, the teacher, or when the teacher was responding to this student's writing, she noticed that shape that's circled that looks sort of like an M, and so attributed meaning to it. You wrote an M. I can use M to write the word mug, tying it back to the picture. So then she took out another piece of paper. She's not going to mess with the student's writing paper, and modeled writing M-U-G. And once again, we're not having the student, asking the student to write the word mug. We're not correcting what they wrote. We're just taking the opportunity to model and show them how literate others use writing. And what we find over time, at first kids just are scribbling just across the page. And then if we have the context, then we can say, you know, I am so excited that you wrote this story about dragons. This is how I write the word dragon. And then you can write the word dragon. What we start to see with kids is we'll start to see that scribbling disappear and separate characters emerge. And then we'll see the beginning of approximations of the shapes and forms of letters through the modeling process. And we see kids who are passionate about writing. So that's cool. Just a word on the conventional literacy piece. As we said before, this is for those students who have a way to communicate and interact. They understand the letters and words of that letters and words make up our writing. They know most of the letters of the alphabet, and they actively engage in shared reading. And the primary goal that we're working toward for these students is the high bar of comprehension, which is really that students can read silently with understanding, that they could look at a sign and decode it and understand it silently in their head. That's really what reading comprehension is. And the focus that we've had on that is really we're thinking about word identification, whole text print processing, and language comprehension. And within all of these areas, there are tons of skills that we then are working on developing. So I'm not going to go any deeper into comprehensive literacy instruction, but I would just say, if anybody's interested in participating in professional development and coaching support in any of these areas, let me know. Our team is available to help facilitate that process across the state for an individual teacher or for a school or a school district, just so that we can get more quantity and higher quality instruction to this group of students. So thanks for your time, and any questions?
Leslie, thank you so much.